next item on the agenda is the Wainui Wastewater Stage 2 consultation outcome and the report by the chairperson of the Infrastructure, Transport and Environment Committee. So could the relevant staff come to the end of the table, and I will invite the chair of the Infrastructure, Transport and Environment Committee to present the paper.
Well, just briefly, councillors will be aware that there is funding in the long-term plan. I think it's the year 23, so the funding is there. There has been extensive consultation with the residents of Wainui and the batch holders, and councillors have been involved in that consultation too. There was a very strong support for the project to be proceeded with, and with that in mind, particularly because of the environmental issues around pollution of the Wainui Harbour, the Infrastructure, Transport and Environmental Committee supported the staff supported the option of option 1 really, which is that in fact that the scheme be proceeded with. But staff can explain the particular environmental features that particularly the committee addressed.
Could I also perhaps get some commentary from staff around the timing? Because as I understand it, if that is the decision, then it comes forward in our long-term plan, and if it comes forward in our long-term plan, it has an impact on rates. So I think we need to understand what that looks like, and whether there is an option of also leaving it at 2023, because that wouldn't have an impact on rates. So perhaps if that could be run through, and I'm not saying that the environmental issues aren't important. We've got huge environmental challenges in all of our rivers and waterways. So, this is one component of a city that has suffered considerable environmental stress as a result of the earthquakes.
If I can cover off that first aspect, and I'll leave it for the officials to talk to the aspect itself. Because it's currently in our list of changes for 2023, bringing it back into this next year, 1 July, and then through for a year and a half would have the impact on next year's rates of 0.02%, 0.08% for the following year, and 0.06% for the year after that. So that's just the impact of what we have now as a submission or a recommendation is 23. Pulling it back in has those rates impact.
Right, thank you. Right, so who would like to lead off on the environmental aspects? I'll get an introduction from staff first.
Well, it became apparent during the consultation with the residents out there, particularly those who are permanent residents, that there are a number of issues with the septic tanks that are there and the other systems that are in place, long drops and storage tanks that don't always operate as one would intend, and some of the properties aren't particularly suitable for the use of septic tanks. Just they don't have the space, and the soil conditions aren't conducive to soakage into the ground. It's fair to say, I think, that the residents weren't keen to pot each other in terms of who had the worst septic tank, but it was fairly evident that some of the conditions there are somewhat unsanitary, particularly in holiday periods when there's more people there and these systems get overloaded to a higher degree. So those are probably the key environmental issues.
Whose responsibility is it to maintain septic tanks?
Property owner's responsibility to maintain a septic tank, so if that's what they have.
Yeah, and we asked questions during the course of the hearings about composting toilets. How do they stack up financially?
That's a possibility in some situations. Generally, you need to have some elevation to have a composting toilet, sort of a couple of metres off the ground. quite often, I think that's where the term thrown came from.
And regular use too, I'm told.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it
But
wouldn't
that
be,
still
wouldn't
doesn't.
be suitable for a holiday home.
Probably not. No. That just caters for the toilet waste. There's also the grey water from the rest of the household that needs to be dealt with as well.
Okay. Paul?
My question is more a comparison for environmental issues, and obviously you know about the environmental issues these guys have. With the damaged infrastructure we have in Christchurch and the leaching into the waterways here, and the many thousands of people that use the sewer and the wastewater systems, which are quite critically damaged, would you say, in your opinion, that the problem is worse on this side of the hill than it is on Wainui?
You're trying to compare two different things, really.
It's really about, though, the damaged infrastructure we have in here is the ways are getting leached into by the sewer and the waste.
Our waterways do suffer overflows in wet weather. The rest of the time, most of the infiltration is into the sewer system, not out of it.
That's in the winter?
Well, any time when the groundwater level's
Correct.
up, yeah.
So in the summer, when it's dry and the table goes down, it goes out.
There's not much driving head to drive wastewater out of the pipes. There's the depth in the pipe, and there's lots of lumps on the inside to help block up the cracks. But when you're in the other way around, when the groundwater's high and the level's low in the pipe, the water pours in. So the net effect is greatly towards inflow and infiltration rather than exfiltration.
Yeah, it's asking for a comparison that's probably hard for staff. Phil and then Andrew.
But just before I ask my question, I just want to clarify for councillors, I said option 1, in fact it is option 3, which actually is the project will proceed immediately. My question really is around the pollution aspects, and perhaps, and my understanding is in fact it's hard to measure the quantity, say, that comes from agriculture by way of farming and animals that it ends up in the Wainui harbour, as against the human part of batches and septic tanks. But could you just perhaps explain a little bit about those the different streams, if you like, of pollution? But also, could you comment on one aspect which certainly was a concern, was that there had been an incident of norovirus in the community which was traced to the Wainui area. But could you just comment on those aspects of pollution, please?
The general runoff from agricultural land does contribute to bugs in the harbour and pollution in the harbour, and it's very difficult to tell the difference. Well, you have to set out to measure the difference between the source of bugs, and you need lots of high numbers to be able to measure that difference. So it comes from both sources. The results of the consultation, people talked about smelling sewage in the roadside drains in summertime, smelling sewage on the beach. So I think that's indicative of leaching from systems into the environment when it's dry. In wet weather you usually don't notice it because it runs off quite quickly and into the water. The monitoring that's done is relatively intermittent. It's 1 day a week in the summer for 15 weeks. And that's, and sometimes you pick up lots of bugs, usually in wet weather. But the norovirus issue, that's very difficult to pinpoint the source of, but the source of norovirus is human waste, and it can be passed through water or it can be passed by hand-to-mouth contact. So can't tell where it came from, but the source of norovirus is human.
Andrew?
Thank you. Just to follow on from Councillor Lonsdale's question, maybe if I put that question in a slightly different way. In terms of value for money and environmental outcomes, and in terms of prioritising various projects that we could do, where would this Wainui wastewater scheme fit on that list of priorities? Would it be a high priority or a lower priority project in terms of those environmental outcomes?
I think it's a reasonably high priority project, relatively.
Great, thank you. There's been a lot of talk about the continued use of septic tanks, and in particular people's ability to replace septic tanks or to install septic tanks in place of long drops and so on. Having been out to Wainui and had a look, and having spoken to a number of the residents out there, you know, the ground conditions obviously vary from property to property, and it's my understanding that there are some properties, in fact probably quite a large number of properties, where a septic tank is not a possibility. Are you able to make some comment on the reasons for that and what would prevent a septic tank being used in those cases?
The septic tank's not the issue, it's the field drainage from the septic tank. And if the property doesn't have a lot of space, it doesn't have space to put a field drainage system in. And there's some properties over there that are on very steep sections, partially on rock, that you don't get any drainage from anyway. So those sorts of properties either have a hole in the ground or some sort of storage tank that they get pumped out from time to time.
Thank you. And final question. We're talking obviously about certain considerations about when this work gets done, whether it gets done now as planned or whether it's deferred. And my question really relates to the financial value of deferring it. I guess the first question is it fair to say this work needs to be done at some point anyway? And the follow-on question from that would be, is it fair to say that it would be more expensive to do it later than it would to do it sooner, so we're actually better just to get on with it?
Well, certainly it will be more expensive the longer we leave it, and it does need to be done at some point.
So not doing the work at all isn't an option?
I don't think that's an option at all, no.
Tim?
I guess and I've asked this question before. With the individuals maintaining whether they're long drops or whether they are septic tanks, could the environment have improved if that was undertaken? Because some of the questions and some of the feedback was that this has not been done. In fact, one guy sent EQC away when they came and suggested they were going to fix his sewer pipes. He said, oh, there's no point because the council's going to do that, although successive councils over the last 20 years haven't done anything. So, I mean, if the standard of maintenance by those submitters had been better, would this problem be less?
For a lot of it, I don't think it's an issue around maintenance for a lot of the septic tanks. They're never going to work in those conditions. And like it or not, previous councils have permitted development, permitted buildings to go up in these places, have permitted long drops as the source of waste disposal. So that's the situation we're in.
Whose job is it to inspect septic tanks?
It's a regional council function, and they will do that, but usually only on the basis of someone complaining. If someone's septic tank is overflowing onto the neighbours might complain about that. But generally, people don't seem to want to pot their neighbours.
So even you know you have an environment that is sensitive, they won't react to that. Is that correct?
They don't go looking routinely inspecting septic tanks, no.
And we have no information to assist our residents, do we, with regards to, I know that Auckland and both Gisborne and other councils have good information on maintaining and managing the septic tanks. We have nothing, do we?
Generally not considered an urban issue. It's generally a rural issue, and the regional council provide consents for septic tank installations.
But a consent is different to maintenance advice, isn't it?
Yes.
So we knew we've got a problem in a sensitive environment, but technically we've done nothing in that sense into preventing anything.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Just a question on the, what was the question I was going to ask? Look, I'll take Jimmy because, sorry, my brain's not working.
Two questions. The first, 2.3, regarding to the consultation. And do you have any information regarding to those 6 others, including the MKT, the Heritage New Zealand, and the Community Public Health, their response? they support the option 1, option 2, or option 3?
I know NKT certainly supported getting it done now.
Yes.
I think the Community and Public Health also supported getting it done now.
Okay.
Some of the other non-resident submissions were from odd organisations
Yes.
that didn't really have much to do with the issue, I felt. Heritage New Zealand, for example. They were more concerned about what happens when we go and dig holes.
Okay. And second questions are regarding the cost compared to the last year. It's kind of increase from the original 7 million to the 8 million. So around the 1 million, almost 14%, except the natural inflation, who else? Those.
I'll ask the project manager to answer that in detail, but you'll notice that the committee asked us to look at the costs again because it's been quite some time since these estimates came in. And this is the revised cost, and you're right, it is an extra million.
This quote is from the original, the tender. It's the original one?
No, this is an up.
Updated estimate. The original
Okay.
tender price was less, but that's gone now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Raf, yeah.
Couple of questions. So it says here there's only 60 permanent residents. Is that correct? So I mean, what's the cost per property of doing this?
It depends how you want to express it, per permanent resident, per property, per developable property. There's
Per permanent resident.
I've got a calculator.
It worked out.
Close.
Didn't we work it out? That
We
was
did.
$66,000 per property or something?
$70,000 per permanent resident.
$70,000 per property
Yeah.
of permanent residents when we take
Yes.
out the holiday homes.
In
So
terms-
very
I mean,
expensive.
I presume a lot of these houses have been here for some time.
Yes.
So, I mean, is it not the responsibility of the householder to make sure they're not polluting the natural environment?
Yes.
And are there rules or fines in place for that sort of thing?
Environment Canterbury can take action against a property for polluting the environment. I'm sure the Medical Officer of Health could also take action if one
So I'm
property was
just
causing
wondering
a
why
nuisance to another.
the council is having to bear the cost of doing this. I mean, clearly, it's a lovely scheme and all that, but I mean, why are we having to pay for it?
I think it's just historical that councils have allowed development in areas that weren't serviced with a sewer system, and over the years Christchurch has done the same, has extended the sewer system out and out and out and picked up those outlying areas, and Banks Peninsula is no different.
So in terms of option one, which is, I hate to use the word cost sharing, but a cost sharing arrangement with the council, could you just explain how that would work out?
The intent of that option was to ask the property owners really what would they feel about sharing a part of the cost. That's not been done for these pressure sewer systems installations in the city in existing areas, existing sewered areas. The upshot of it is it would take about 15% off the total cost that the property owners would then have to bear, but then they may choose not to join up, at least initially.
But I mean, obviously in town you expect to be on the town
Yes.
sewer system. Obviously these houses have been here for a long time and have been
Some
used
have,
to
yeah.
taking care of their own sewerage facilities. And in terms of the consultation, I mean, clearly nobody wants to pay for it, but I just struggle to see why council should be bearing the full cost of this. And in terms of these options, there's no options here for putting new modern septic tanks on these properties. Is that something that was considered?
It's not a realistic option to do that. The properties just don't have the space or the ground conditions to be able to take a septic tank and a field tile. Some do, and some work okay. About half the properties there have a septic tank, of all the properties there, and about half of those operate okay. So there's 75% of the properties that have a septic tank that's not working very well, or a long drop, or one even has an electric toilet, a cooker. So largely an unsatisfactory situation.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yanni?
Thank you. I was just understanding that we're almost doubling the growth in population by, if that scheme goes ahead, that now frees up that development. So have we looked at an option where through the DC's policy that we could expect those new properties to pay for the cost of the scheme, which is effectively a subsidy to that private developer to be able to, make lots of money from the rezoning. So, could we do something like put in the scheme, but then have the 20,000 per property for new connections based on that growth that the scheme will enable?
That's effectively what DCs do, but it's not, the figure globally across the city is not 20,000 for wastewater. It's around 10 maybe, 8 to 10. So that's what new properties would pay when they join up to the system.
Yeah. So
there's about 100 properties we believe that are ready to go in terms of development as well.
Right, and there may be other people that are rezoning land waiting for this decision that will, buy up the land.
They will end up paying DCs as well. Yeah.
So what I'm asking though is, if we were concerned about the cost of the scheme and we wanted a more of a cost share type option, to expect new development to pay an even greater percentage, is that something we can do?
I'm sure the council could decide to have a targeted development contribution if they wish.
For that area. Mm-hmm. Okay. I don't know whether financial staff want to.
I don't know whether that's correct. So, Mike, would you like to comment on that? Because it is a development contribution question. I don't know that we can, under the law, target in that way, but we could do a targeted rate.
We can have
on the properties.
We can have a catchment for DCs, and I think we can have it as big or as small as we want. But we make that decision through this long-term plan process.
Yeah, I think you'd be very careful about trying to narrow catchments down to individual small groups. It may be possible in an area like Wainui. One of the things we'd have to check out legally is we can't recover DCs for backlog. We can't recover DCs for a level of service lower than we would be required to provide. So it can only happen where there is new and real growth, and that's the only portion we can recover through DC. So, and I'm not entirely familiar with the Wainui situation, but it may not be as straightforward as simply saying we can add an extra DC charge to those properties.
Did you have another question?
Yeah, in terms of the resource consent, was there any requirement on the developer to pay a contribution towards the upgrade of the infrastructure? One of the submissions we heard was really critical of the fact we want people living in the central city and we want to have more efficient use of our existing infrastructure rather than the idea that we continuously spend huge amounts of money for this kind of growth on the periphery. So I just wondered, in terms of the question of who's paying for it, whether through that rezoning or that consent, that there was any condition on the developer to pay a certain amount if they wanted that development to happen.
The consent for the wastewater there is for discharge to land. It doesn't take into account who's contributing to that discharge. It's merely around the conditions to which we can discharge to the land.
I'm clear. So basically, the consent says if you can discharge to land, you can build as much as you want.
No.
But or 100 properties or however many you've applied for.
Well, in the design of the system so far, for the application to land, it takes into account future growth. The capacity of the system for the land application that's already there takes into account the future growth.
Right. But I'm just trying to think, like, there's an existing subdivision consent? Or
No,
there's an
not
existing
yet.
resource consent?
No, simply because there's no sewer system for them to connect to, so they don't get a consent.
Right, so there's nothing in terms of the 100 proposed properties. It's just
They're not consented yet, no.
consented, but they've got the zoning for that.
Yes.
Right, okay.
David?
Look, we heard just earlier that there are 60 permanent residents. We had 88 submissions, but I'm a little unclear as to what's the total number of properties in the area, and just how many of them are septic, long drop, or any other. Cool. That's just
There's about 160 existing properties. 34 or 35 are on an existing gravity network through a developer-built treatment plant some years ago that is now directed up to a forest block for land application. It used to be a harbour discharge. It's now going to land. So that leaves about 125, 26 existing properties. And of the total properties, about 60 are permanent residents. So there's about 66 odd that are holiday homes.
So what's the ratio of septic tanks to long drops to anything else?
I understand about half the properties that are not on this existing reticulation system. Half the properties have septic tanks and the other half have some other sort of system, a long drop storage tank, electric toilet, whatever.
And how, do you know what the regularity of a clean of a septic tank would be over there?
It depends on the use. Some would be annual, some would be 5 yearly.
So if someone cleaned their septic tank annually,
It's not the cleaning of the tank, it's the disposal field and the ability of the disposal field to take the water from the septic tank. The septic tank's not a storage vessel as such, it's a treatment process, partial treatment process.
An annual clean of it would surely improve the efficiency of the septic tank.
Not necessarily, no. It depends how the solids are building up in it and at what point it starts to get full.
Wondering whether in the short term it would be cheaper to clean the septic tanks regularly rather than expend a huge amount of money.
I don't think frequency of cleaning septic tanks up to a point would improves the operation of them.
Ellie?
Page 42 looks at some of the breakdown of costs and the estimate. There are a number of unknowns highlighted in that. And so I'm asking whether that is of a concern to you and potentially what that could mean as far as costs go. But also I see the treatment plant is sourced from overseas and is quite a large percentage of the overall cost. Are you confident that that is the only plant that's available and there's nothing available closer or cheaper than that?
Ask Peter Brocklehurst to answer that. He's the project manager.
This, Councillor, is why there is $1 million contingency. All the specialised... Sorry. All the available treatment plants, packaged treatment plants, we call them black box, okay? They do come from overseas. This particular one comes from France. And it is subject to Forex. And we all know what's happened in the last month on our exchange rate. That is one of the biggest unknowns. The cost of purchase and installation of that was 1.7 million in McConnell Dowell's latest estimate, and I do say that was only an estimate, which we asked them to do back in November. It was an estimate based on their previous tendered price, plus some allowance for escalation, but nothing for foreign exchange.
And there are some issues around ground conditions as well.
There are indeed. We have learned a lesson from the work we did in Charters Bay on a similar scheme, that it is impossible to know on 126 properties to go and survey them geotechnically prior to tendering. It is also the exact location of the grinder pumps on any given section is to a large extent up to the property owner exactly where they want it. And we don't know the route until we know the final location. And
have what that could add to costs? Do you have any idea?
in Charters Bay we know what it cost, and that's that sort of percentage we did allow in our contingency, which is the $1 million effectively.
Right, okay.
Tim, again.
What is the robustness of this? You know, you've given us the numbers with regards to dwellings, permanent versus holiday. I'm just wondering, we're looking at a subdivision of another 100 sections. How robust, how future-proofed is this waste treatment plant? I mean, we're already looking at, as Ellie mentioned, you know, if you're looking at the summary or 3.3 on page, was it 34, with regards to it could be another $1 million. So I'm just wondering how robust this is. Is it set up to cater for what number? Because we have no idea what may happen in the future with development. We've got this development that's 100 sections is almost going to double the population.
Oh, the design for the treatment plant is modular, so that you can add units to it to increase its capacity over time if you need to. We'll provide for the basic existing number of properties in a part of the development, but as development occurs over time, we can add modules to it. We haven't specified a particular type of treatment plant. We've made a suggestion as to one that would be okay, and I think in the tender round we got several different options for treatment plants in the tender process.